Love is not always a bright flame. Sometimes it is the steady warmth of a fire built in the wilderness to keep the darkness at bay. In Redemption Gulch, dust was a currency and hope was scarce. Abigail Finch lived in the shadow of both. As the late schoolteacher's daughter, she possessed a quiet grace that the town found unsettling. She survived by mending clothes for the general store, her nimble fingers a stark contrast to the calloused hands around her. She lived alone in a small, weathered cabin on the edge of town, a silent testament to a life of quiet dignity. The townspeople watched her, some with pity, others with a suspicion reserved for anyone who did not bend to the harshness of the land. She walked with her chin held high, her gaze steady, carrying books as if they were shields against the world's grit. This quiet strength did not go unnoticed. Silas Blackwood, whose father, the judge, owned most of Redemption Gulch, saw Abigail as a challenge. He was a man accustomed to taking what he wanted, his wealth a hammer that flattened all obstacles. He approached her outside the mercantile one afternoon, his smile thin and predatory. "A woman like you should not be troubled with such meager work, Miss Finch," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "My father has need of a hostess for his gatherings. The gowns would suit you." He offered a future of comfort, but his eyes offered only possession. It was a transaction, and she was the commodity he intended to acquire. Abigail met his gaze without flinching. Her hands, holding a newly purchased sack of flour, did not tremble. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice clear and calm for all to hear. "But I find my current work fulfilling. My father taught me the value of earning my own keep." The rejection was polite, yet absolute. It was not a coy refusal, but a definitive dismissal. A ripple of quiet murmurs went through the few onlookers. No one spoke to Silas Blackwood that way. His smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of cold fury in his eyes. The public nature of her refusal was a wound to his immense pride, a stain on his authority. He did not press the matter. Instead, he gave a stiff nod, his face a mask of false courtesy. "As you wish," he said, turning on his heel and walking away. But Abigail felt his gaze on her back. A physical weight of resentment. She knew this was not the end. Men like Silas did not forgive slights. They collected them like debts. That night, the wind howled around her small cabin, sounding like a mournful whisper. She sat by her small fire, the book in her lap unread, a profound sense of dread settling over her, like the coming winter frost. She was alone, and she had just made a powerful enemy in a town that preyed upon the weak. The annual Harvest Festival arrived, cloaking Redemption Gulch in a facade of boisterous cheer. Fiddles scraped out jaunty tunes from the saloon, and the air grew thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and roasting meat. It was a night of forced celebration, a brief respite from the daily grind. Abigail had worked late, balancing the mercantile's ledgers, and now made her way home under a moonless sky. She kept to the shadows, hoping to pass through the town unnoticed. The raucous laughter spilling from the saloon doors felt like a warning, each cheer a note in a rising symphony of danger she could not yet name. She clutched her shawl tighter, but shadows offered little protection. As she passed the narrow alley between the stables and the blacksmith's forge, a hand shot out and grabbed her arm. Silas Blackwood pulled her into the darkness, his two cronies blocking the entrance. The smell of liquor on his breath was overpowering. "Well, look what we have here," Silas sneered, his voice losing its polished edge. "The little schoolmarm, too good for the rest of us." His friends chuckled, their shapes large and menacing in the gloom. The music from the saloon seemed a world away now, a distant echo of a life from which she had just been violently torn. Her heart pounded against her ribs. "Let me go, Silas," Abigail said, her voice steady despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. She refused to show him the terror he so clearly wanted to see. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think your books give you importance? Your fancy words? Out here, there is only one kind of power." He reached out and snatched the small book of poetry she carried, tossing it into a muddy puddle. "This is what I think of your education." He towered over her, his face a mask of contempt. He despised her quiet intellect, seeing it as a judgment on his own brutish nature. He saw her not as a person, but as a symbol of something he could not control. His rage, simmering since her public rejection, finally boiled over. He brought out a heavy leather whip, not to strike, but to intimidate. He let the tail of it drag through the dirt at her feet. "You live on our land, Miss Finch. You breathe our air," he hissed, his face close to hers, "and you will learn respect." In a final act of defiance, Abigail spat on the ground beside his polished boots. The act was small, but the insult was immense. Silas's face contorted with fury. All pretense of control vanished. In that moment he was no longer the judge's son. He was just a brute, ready to break what he could not possess. Silas threw the whip aside, his eyes landing on a discarded iron rod near the forge. The world narrowed to the glint of metal in the faint light. "You want to be strong?" he snarled, grabbing the rod. The first blow was swift and brutal. It landed on her left forearm with a sickening, dull crack that was lost in a swell of music from the saloon. A sharp, blinding pain shot up her arm, stealing her breath. She did not scream, but a choked gasp escaped her lips. The world tilted, the darkness of the alley spinning around her as she staggered, trying to stay upright. The faces of his friends swam before her, grinning like gargoyles. Before she could process the first wave of agony, the second blow came. The iron rod struck her right arm, and the sound of breaking bone echoed in the small space. This time, a cry was torn from her throat, sharp and raw. Her knees gave way, and she collapsed into the mud and grime of the alley. Her arms were useless, hanging at unnatural angles, the pain and all-consuming fire. Silas stood over her, breathing heavily, his rage spent. "Now you know your place," he said, his voice cold and empty. He and his men turned and walked away, melting back into the festival as if nothing had happened. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, curled in the dirt. The sounds of the town continued unabated, a cruel mockery of her private hell. Doors remained shut. Windows stayed dark. The town had seen, or heard, or simply known, and it had chosen silence. It was a collective turning away, a community's decision that one woman's suffering was not worth the trouble of confronting a Blackwood. This betrayal was a deeper wound than the broken bones. It was the realization that she was utterly, completely alone. Her sobs were silent, tears carving clean tracks through the dirt on her face. Hours later, when the town had finally drunk itself into a stupor, a sliver of will returned. She could not die here. She would not give Silas that victory. Gritting her teeth against the waves of pain, she began to move. Using her elbows and knees, she started to crawl. Each movement was an agony, dragging her useless arms through the filth. Inch by agonizing inch, she pulled herself out of the alley and toward the edge of town. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away, moving toward the dark, silent hills that promised either oblivion or a different kind of survival. The sun was a pale smear in the eastern sky when Abigail's strength finally gave out. She had crawled through the night, a broken creature leaving a desperate trail in the dust. She reached the rocky foothills at the edge of the plains and collapsed at the base of a gnarled juniper tree. The world faded into a haze of pain. These lands were the fringes, the space between the world of settlers and the territories of the Arapaho. Few from Redemption Gulch ever ventured this far. It was a place of ghosts and old fears, a land that belonged to itself and to those who understood its harsh language. Her trail did not go unnoticed. Coda, a warrior of the Arapaho, saw the disturbed earth from a ridge above. He had been tracking a hawk, his mind quiet and watchful. He lived alone in these hills, a self-imposed exile. The coughing sickness brought by the settlers had taken his wife and child years ago, leaving him a hollow man. He had turned his back on the world of his people and the world of the white man, finding solace only in the company of the wind and the stones. He carried his grief like a second skin, a constant, silent companion in the vast emptiness. He approached the trail with caution. The drag marks were not those of a wounded animal. They spoke of human desperation. Following the path, his gaze sharp and analytical, he found her. She was a crumpled heap of torn fabric and matted hair, her breathing shallow and ragged. He saw the unnatural angles of her arms, the bruising already purpling her skin. He knelt beside her, his face an impassive mask, but his eyes took in every detail of the brutality she had endured. He had seen the cruelty of the settlers before. It was a familiar poison. This, however, was different. It was personal. A conflict raged within him. To help her was to invite the world he had forsaken back into his life. She was one of them, the people whose proximity had brought only death and sorrow. His first instinct was to walk away, to leave her to the fate her own kind had assigned her. But then he saw the faint track of a dried tear on her cheek, a small, clean line in the grime. It was a sign of a spirit that had not been entirely extinguished. It reminded him of his wife's quiet strength. He stood for a long moment, the wind whispering through the rocks, before making a decision that would change both their lives. With a quiet resolve, Coda gently gathered Abigail into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as fragile as a bird. He moved with a sure-footed grace through the rocky terrain, carrying her toward his hidden dwelling. It was not a simple teepee, but a sturdy, semi-permanent lodge built cleverly into an alcove in the rocks, shielded from the wind and prying eyes. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, sage, and the faint smoke of a recent fire. He laid her carefully on a bed of soft furs, her brokenness a stark contrast to the quiet order of his home. He knew he was inviting trouble. He did not have the medicines of the white doctors, the vials of laudanum or bottles of harsh chemicals. He had something older, the knowledge passed down through generations of his people. He moved with quiet efficiency, starting a small smokeless fire to heat water. He went to a leather pouch and took out dried herbs and roots. He ground willow bark into a fine powder, mixing it with water to make a paste that would ease the fever he knew was coming. His hands, though calloused from the hunt, were surprisingly gentle as he worked. This was a different kind of skill, a healing art. The most difficult task was setting the bones. He prepared splints from straight, strong branches of cedar, smoothing them with his knife. He made a poultice of comfrey root, known to his people as knit bone, to aid the mending. He braced himself. Then, with a firm, practiced motion, he straightened her left arm. A pained moan escaped her unconscious lips. He paused, his jaw tight, then moved to the right arm, repeating the brutal but necessary act. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. He was not just mending bones. He was fighting back against the cruelty of the world in the only way he knew how. Once the bones were set and splinted, he carefully wrapped her arms in clean strips of soft doeskin. He washed the dirt and dried blood from her face with a damp cloth. He saw the fine lines of intelligence around her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness. She was a stranger, an enemy by birth, yet in that moment, she was simply a life entrusted to his care. As night fell, he sat by the fire, watching her even breathing. He had chosen to intervene, and now her fate was tied to his. The solitude of his world had been broken. Abigail drifted back to consciousness slowly, through layers of pain and fevered dreams. The first thing she registered was warmth, a stark contrast to the cold she remembered. The second was the scent of wood smoke and unfamiliar herbs. She opened her eyes. She was in a dwelling of wood and hide, lit by the soft glow of a fire. Her arms were bound tightly to her chest, encased in splints. Panic surged through her, cold and sharp. Then she saw him, a figure sitting silently across the small space. His face was stern, his eyes dark and watchful. It was a face carved by grief and solitude. She tried to push herself up, a whimper escaping her lips as a fresh wave of pain seared through her arms. The man rose, not with a sudden movement, but with a slow, deliberate grace that was not threatening. He held up a hand, palm open, a universal sign to be still. He spoke a single word in a language she did not understand, but his tone was calming. He approached her and knelt, offering a shallow wooden bowl filled with warm broth. The smell was rich and savory. Her fear warred with the primal need for sustenance. His gaze was steady, not demanding but offering. Hesitantly, she opened her mouth. He fed her the broth, one careful spoonful at a time. This simple act of kindness was so unexpected, it brought tears to her eyes. He was a stranger, one of the native people her town called heathens. yet he showed her more compassion than anyone in Redemption Gulch. The days that followed blurred into a routine of quiet care. He would tend to the fire, prepare food, and change the herbal poultices on her arms. He rarely spoke, and his silence was a balm. It was not empty, but full of a quiet respect that she had never known from the men in her own world. Meanwhile, back in Redemption Gulch, Martha, the mercantile owner's wife, was plagued by guilt. She had heard the commotion in the alley that night. She had seen Silas and his friends emerge, laughing. She had done nothing, frozen by the fear of what the Blackwoods might do to her family's business. Now, Abigail was gone, presumed to have run off in shame. Martha looked at her own hands, capable and whole, and felt a profound sense of cowardice. The silence of the town was a weight on her soul, a shared sin that grew heavier with each passing day. As the fever subsided and the pain dulled to a constant ache, Abigail began to truly see her rescuer. His name was Coda. Communication was a slow, patient process. She would point to objects, and he would give her the Arapaho word. He, in turn, would listen intently as she spoke, his understanding growing. She told him about her father, the schoolteacher, who believed books could build bridges between people. Coda seemed to understand this. He showed her the intricate patterns on a piece of beadwork, a story told in color and shape, as complex as any text. One evening by the light of the fire, he used a piece of charcoal to draw on a flat stone. He drew a man, a woman, and a small child. Then he drew small, floating specks all around them, and made a coughing sound. He wiped the figures away, leaving only the lone man. The simple drawing conveyed a world of loss more powerfully than any words. Abigail's heart ached for him. She understood now that his silence was not a lack of feeling, but a deep well of it. He was a man who had lost his entire world, yet had found it in himself to save a piece of hers. She, in turn, found the courage to speak of her own ordeal. She described the alley, the laughter, the feeling of utter abandonment by her own people. As she spoke, Coda listened without interruption, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply bore witness to her pain, and in doing so, he lessened its power. The space between them, once filled with fear and silence, was now filled with a fragile, growing trust. It was a connection forged not in words, but in the shared language of survival and grief. This shared vulnerability began to blossom into something more. It was in the way he would gently help her rebraid her hair, his large hands surprisingly deft. It was in the way she would save a portion of her meal for him, a small gesture of care. One day, a sudden thunderstorm crashed over the hills. A loud clap of thunder made her flinch, a raw memory of the iron rods striking. Coda, seeing her distress, moved to sit near her, not touching but simply being a solid, reassuring presence until the storm passed. In his stillness, she found a safety she had never known. In Redemption Gulch, Silas Blackwood's anger festered. The town's whispers about Abigail's disappearance annoyed him. He had intended to break her, not make her a martyr. To reassert his dominance, he concocted a new narrative. He went to his father, his face a mask of false concern. "Father," he said, "I fear the worst." Miss Finch was distraught. "I believe she wandered into the hills and was taken by a savage." He planted the seed of fear, knowing it would grow quickly in the fertile ground of the town's prejudice. He needed a scapegoat, and the native people were the easiest target. Judge Blackwood, a man whose power depended on the illusion of control, readily accepted the story. An untamed woman and a hostile native were threats to his order. He stood on the steps of the courthouse and addressed the town. "A good woman of our community is missing," he thundered, "taken by the heathens who plague our lands. I am offering a reward. $100 in gold for the return of Abigail Finch, and for the head of the savage who took her." The sum was enormous. It was an open license for any man with a firearm and a greedy heart to hunt in the hills. Sheriff Miller, a man caught between his conscience and his fear of the judge, reluctantly pinned the notice to the board. He knew Silas was a liar, but he lacked the courage to challenge him. The notice drew a crowd of eager men, their eyes glinting with the promise of gold. They were not lawmen, they were prospectors, drifters, and ranch hands eager for a payday. They saw the bounty not as a call for justice, but as an opportunity. The hills, once a place of quiet dread, were now seen as a treasure chest, and Coda was the lock they intended to break. Word of the bounty traveled fast. An old trapper, who sometimes traded with Coda, heard the news and made the dangerous journey to the hidden lodge. He respected Coda and owed him for a past kindness. He warned him of the coming danger. When Coda told Abigail, her blood ran cold. The man who had saved her was now a target because of her. Her healing had put him in mortal danger. "They will not stop," she said, her voice trembling. "They will hunt you down." She looked at her own hands, the bones slowly mending, and knew she could not let her rescuer die for his act of compassion. "I must go back," Abigail declared, her voice filled with a new, hard strength. Her arms were still weak, but her spirit was not. "If I stay here, they will hunt you forever, but if I return, their story falls apart." Coda watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fierce will that had allowed her to crawl from that alley. To let her go back alone was unthinkable. To go with her was to walk directly into the jaws of the beast. He gave a single, slow nod. He would not let her face them alone. He would stand with her, whatever the cost. They traveled at dusk, moving through the familiar landscape that now felt fraught with danger. Coda moved like a shadow, his senses on high alert, while Abigail walked with a resolve that surprised even herself. They entered Redemption Gulch as the last light of day bled from the sky. Their appearance on the main street caused an immediate stir. People stopped in their tracks. Conversations died, and faces turned toward them in disbelief. The woman presumed dead or captive was walking freely, and beside her stood the savage they were being paid to kill. Silas Blackwood emerged from the saloon, his face a mixture of shock and rage. "There he is," he shouted, pointing a finger. "The savage who abducted her. Seize him!" A few men from the crowd moved forward hesitantly, their hands on their sidearms. But before they could act, Coda moved. It was not an attack, but a display of breathtaking speed and skill. In a series of fluid motions, he disarmed the two closest men, their own revolvers now in his hands, aimed steadily but not threateningly. He did not speak. His action spoke for him, a clear message of controlled power. With the crowd held in a stunned silence, Abigail stepped forward. She looked directly at Judge Blackwood, who stood frozen on the courthouse steps. "He did not abduct me," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "He saved me. He saved me from your son." She turned to the crowd. "Your son, who left me broken in an alley because I would not bow to him. You all knew, you all heard, and you all did nothing." A heavy silence fell. Then a voice cut through it. "She is telling the truth." It was Martha, the mercantile owner's wife, stepping out from the crowd, her face pale but determined. "I saw it." Martha's words shattered the town's collective silence. Another man, the blacksmith, stepped forward. "I found an iron rod in the alley the next morning," he said gruffly. "It had no business being there." One by one, small truths emerged, chipping away at the foundation of fear the Blackwoods had built. The crowd's gaze shifted from Coda to Silas, their expressions now a mixture of contempt and dawning shame. The authority of Judge Blackwood evaporated in the face of the truth. He saw the tide turn against him, the power he had wielded for so long slipping through his fingers like dust. Realizing they had lost, the judge and his son did not wait for formal justice. Before dawn the next day, their wagon was gone. Redemption Gulch awoke to a new, uncertain quiet. The bounty notice was torn down. In its place, the newly formed town council, which included the blacksmith and Martha's husband, posted a notice of a town meeting. They offered Abigail her father's old position as the town's schoolteacher, a gesture of apology and respect. The town had been given a chance to redeem itself, and it was tentatively taking the first step. Abigail accepted the post, but she did not move back into the town. Her small, weathered cabin on the edge of the wilderness became her home again. Koda stayed with her. He helped her repair the sagging porch and clear a small plot for a garden. He did not belong in the town, and she no longer felt she belonged there entirely either. They found their place in the space between, a bridge between two worlds. The townspeople, in small ways, began to show their respect. A sack of flour left on the porch, a well-forged hinge for the gate, a shy wave from a child. One cool evening, as the stars began to appear, they stood together outside the cabin. "You showed them what strength is," Koda said quietly. Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder. "No," she replied softly. "We showed them." He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. Theirs was not a story of grand passion spoken in loud declarations. It was a love built in silence, in shared pain, and in the profound, simple act of choosing to stand by someone. Together, they planted a young sapling at the edge of the garden, a living symbol of a new beginning, its roots reaching deep into a land that could, after all, learn to heal.